Assalamualaikum and a very good morning to everyone for with us today. Now we are in the 14th CEE UTM webinar, and today we have a very important guest with us to share about how to help your STEM students become self-directed learner. We have Prof. Richard and Prof. Rebecca with us. Okay, for those who are first time with us, don't forget to like and share this video so that everyone can benefit. And there's so many beautiful insight in this webinar. Okay, without further ado, before that, we will also have the link for the attendance. So please click the attendance and do fill out all the details. And also, for those who are first time, you can just drop any comments. We will have the question and answer soon throughout the session. So if you have any question, feel free to just hit the comments and hit any question that you would like to ask for our panels today. Now, without further ado, let us invite our director of the Center for Engineering Education. She is also the president of Society of Engineering Education Malaysia SEA and the Deputy Chair of the Education Cluster Academy of Professor Malaysia. So without further ado, let us welcome Prof. Haria Muhammad Yusof to the stage with us. Hi, Prof. Haria.
Hi, Nina. Assalamualaikum. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, it's good. Thank you so much for bringing Prof. Richard and Prof. Rebecca with us again.
So glad to have them here.
Yeah,
and to share with us.
Yes, we have about 6,000 views. 6.6 thousand views, and we hope that everyone will benefit the session. So the stage is yours, Prof.
Thank you very much, Nina. Well, everyone, the world that we live in today is constantly changing, and with that, we also have opportunity to learn. There's a lot of information available worldwide now. However, the problem is for someone to be able to continuously learn, they have to be self-directed learners. So this is why today we have brought Professor Richard Felder and Dr. Rebecca Brent with us to talk about self-directed learning. Now, Dr. Rebecca Brent is actually a fellow of the American Society of Engineering Education, and she's the president of a consulting firm, Education Designs Incorporated, in North Carolina in the US. She specializes in staff development, staff development for staff in engineering and science, and she also do a lot of consulting for pre-college and college levels education. And Professor Richard Felder is the Herr-Salenist Professor Emeritus of Chemical Engineering from North Carolina State University. He is the co-author of the book Elementary Principles of Chemical Engineering, which would be very, very familiar for those who study chemical engineering throughout the world, not only in the US. Well, they have been my mentors from the beginning since I first started learning about engineering education, and they are the go-to people that I normally refer to, and they have been to Malaysia and to many other countries in Asia. So let us welcome Professor Richard Felder and Dr. Rebecca Brent.
Thanks so much, Kyria. We are so delighted to be with you again.
I just wish we could be with you in person in Malaysia again, and hopefully that day will come. And greetings to all of you who are watching. We're delighted to be with you, even though it is virtually.
Yep, we are so glad to have you here. Thank you for making time for us. It's such a pleasure to be able to listen and learn from you again.
Thank you. We love learning from you as well. And we do learn from all of you who are a part of things and who ask questions, and we're happy to be here. In just a moment, I'm going to start talking with you about self-directed learning. But I want to just make a quick point before we do begin, and that is that with our setup today, we don't have as many opportunities to get you engaged. We will have times for you to ask questions, and we hope you'll drop those questions into the chat. I can see on our other device that a lot of you are doing that already. We will also have a handout that has all of our slides and a lot of resources for you to use at the end of our session today, and that link link will be dropped into the chat and will be available on YouTube. So thanks so much, Kyria, for having us here.
Thank you very much. So we are going to use Mentimeter. I hope it works. Well, and we're going to share with you, yes, we're going to share with you the Mentimeter code, because when we show it in the broadcast studio, there's going to be a 30 seconds delay. But if you do go into Mentimeter, which the code will be shared in a while in the chat area, you will be able to see the Mentimeter polls much, much earlier. Okay? So bear that in mind. So Rebecca and Richard, the stage is yours.
Great. And I can see that the code for Mentimeter is scrolling along the bottom, so that should help you to get ready. All right. Let me take just a moment and get ourselves going. All right. We're going to talk with you today about helping your students become self-directed learners. As Kyria was sharing with us, it is a time when we are really expecting a lot of our students, but even in normal circumstances, we want our students to really become independent. So when Rich and I were thinking about this workshop, we started thinking about, well, what is it that successful professionals do? Professional employees who are working in engineering or science, researchers, entrepreneurs, what do they do? Because that's the world that we're preparing our students for. One thing they do is to clearly define problems that may be really fuzzy, things that are not clear-cut, like in a textbook where given this and this, calculate that. That's not how problems come in the real world for these employees and researchers and entrepreneurs. So defining a problem may be the most important first step. They think outside the box with creativity for things that are haven't been thought of before, problem solving those kinds of problems that occur. They make their decisions based on logic and based on evidence, and they try to use that in convincing other people that their ideas or solutions are the correct ones, and in convincing themselves of the same thing. And then finally, all the way along, they reflect on how they're doing. They seek out resources. All of those things are so important for people when they're professional employees. But it also, as we think about our students, we think about self-direction when they're students. And so we're always aiming for getting them ready for the professional world. But with self-directed learning, it's that process where they themselves organize and manage their own learning needs and activities. But what we can't do is just throw that at them all at once and expect that they're going to do it well just by being told to do it. They have to be helped along the way. And so that's what this workshop is really about. If we think about what self-directed learners do, surprise, it's basically the same as what professionals do. They're going to have to clearly define problems, think outside the box sometimes, make these decisions, and reflect on how they're doing. And we can teach them to do those things by growing them as self-directed learners, teaching them using inductive teaching and learning methods to help them understand and get practice in how to define those problems. We're going to teach them with techniques about creative thinking so that they develop those skills to think outside the box. They're going to be given tasks that involve critical thinking so that their decisions, they grow in their decision making, in their ability to be logical and their ability to find and use evidence. And then we're also going to think about how to use metacognition, how to help them reflect on how they're doing, thinking about their own thinking and learning and selection of resources. So all those same things are what we're going to be thinking about as we try to grow self-directed learners. We're going to focus on each of these areas in the time that we have together. But before we get into that, there is something really important that is a part of the structure of what we're going to be talking with you about. And it's going to keep coming up, these two pillars that Rich will tell you about.
If you think about the things that Rebecca just talked about, what we need to teach our students, all of them are things that we don't normally teach in our engineering curriculum. So we're going to be imposing some serious demands on the students, asking them to do things that they're not used to doing and that probably no one has ever asked them to do before. They're going to have to develop some high-level skills, critical thinking, creative thinking, and so forth. There are two pillars, two things that you have to do if you want to push students to higher levels. The first is challenge. You have to challenge them to do the things that you're trying to teach them to do. But challenge by itself is not enough. You also need support. You have to put difficult tasks in front of students. You have to say, I'm going to impose some serious demands on you to ask you to do some unfamiliar things. But then you come at them and say, and I am going to do everything in my power to help you learn to do those things that I'm trying to teach you. So I'm going to challenge you, but I'm going to give you lots of support on the way. And if you can do those two things, you have a good chance of getting them to where you'd like to get them.
We're going to launch a poll now, and I will stop sharing. And if we can launch the first Mentimeter poll. This poll asks you to think about those two pillars. And the first answer was, which of these do you do more of in your classes? So think about yourself as a professor. The first answer is that you provide challenges. You're doing challenging, you challenge them most. B is I provide support more often. And then C is about the same as each. So we'd like you now, if you haven't already, to look at your Mentimeter poll and put in your answer. We're going to give you just a few moments to do that. And while you do, I will say that in all the times, all the faculty members, the staff members that we've worked with over the years, each of us have a tendency toward one or the other. We may sort of have a tendency to do more challenge and not so much support, or we may be people who tend to be really, really supportive, but we may not always give the highest challenges for our students. So it's very common for that to be kind of uneven and not something that you need to worry about, but we think it's something you should think about. In some of the work that has been done about the pandemic and students suddenly having to work at home, they often have this sense of not having enough support. And so this is something that we really do have to work on. Do we have some of their responses yet? Okay, great. All right. So many of you say that you do about the same of each. And there's a lot of you who talk about doing a lot of support. So we're seeing that as a common one. And I see some of the challenges creeping up there. Great. So I think it's interesting and important to sort of think about yourself as we talk about these things that we're going to be talking about in just a moment, and make notes for yourself of things that you might be able to do with your students that you haven't had a chance to do or don't do as frequently. You should get some new ideas as we go. All right. Thanks so much for the poll, and we appreciate all of you responding. Now I'm going to share my screen again. And we want to share some ideas with you.
Okay, so challenge. When you're trying to help students develop new skills, there's only one way to do it. There's only one way that they develop those skills, and that's to do the things that we're challenging them to do. And when they do it at first, they probably get it wrong. That's how we learned everything we know. You don't get it right the first time. And so we give them opportunities to practice, but then it's important also to give them feedback. When they do it and they do it wrong, we try to help them understand what was wrong with what they did and how might they be able to do it better next time. And the more you do that, the better they're going to be developing those skills. And so the procedure First, you need to clearly identify the skills that you want your students to acquire. And we'll be giving you some ideas about that as we go through the workshop. Then you have to assign tasks to them that require those skills. You can assign them in class for in-class activities. Then you can give them homework assignments in which they have to do the same sorts of things at home. And once they've gotten the practice and feedback, then you put them on exams and give them an opportunity to show you whether and how well they learned what they were supposed to learn. And if you want students to become good at critical thinking, creative thinking, metacognitive thinking, you don't just have a 2-week session in one of the courses on that skill and then they never see it again until after they graduate. If the skill is important, they have to keep seeing it as they go through the curriculum.
That's why it doesn't work so well to just throw a course on critical thinking or a course on creative thinking. You want it integrated in everything that they do. The second pillar that Rich talked about was the pillar for support. And support is the challenge for us as teachers very often. Here are some things that you can do. And remember, I mentioned to you that these slides will all be available to you at the end. So you don't need to make notes on all of this. Just those things you want to be sure to remember for your classes. So the first element of support is to make the expectations clear. We suggest you do that with learning objectives or instructional objectives. Many of you know about objectives or about outcomes in your own teaching, and those are critical for both identifying the challenge and also providing support. I can't know how to do something as a student unless I know what it is I'm expected to do. Another technique you're going to hear us talk about a lot is showing good and bad responses to these difficult challenges so that students see how if they think a certain way, if they take a certain process, what it should look like. And that makes them much more able to do it on their own. We encourage you to model the kind of thinking that's required. You're giving those good and bad examples, but help students to see what an expert like you does and thinks about when you're working through these problems. What questions do you ask yourself? What do you say to yourself as you're doing these tasks? Those things will help students to understand. And sometimes modeling that we make mistakes, and we use those to help us get to the kind of thinking that we want and the kind of solutions we want. Students should see that we make mistakes too, and that that's not a bad thing. That's a part of the process. Then, as Rich said before, provide practice and feedback. And only after you've done that do you put challenges on tests and projects. Sometimes people think, I just need to get my students to think at higher levels or critical thinking, creative thinking, by just giving them an assignment to do that. And that's not very effective. Throwing a hard problem on a test, they haven't had time to practice and get feedback. So make sure that that's a part of what you do for every challenge that you give them. And then the big idea is to scaffold. That means when they're starting out and you start with them as first year, second year students, you start with lots and lots of structure, lots of support, and then gradually you put more and more responsibility on the students.
Just as a reminder of where we are, we're just giving you some general ideas now about turning students into self-directed learners. Tips like give them practice and feedback and so forth. When we get to the specific skills, which we'll be shortly doing, we'll give you some more concrete examples of what kind of things you can ask the students to do and then give them feedback on.
And what we'll be doing, we're about to get into the first strategy. And what we'll do first is talk about how to set the challenge. And then at the end of each section, we'll talk about ways you support students in those challenges. So this is the graphic you're going to see that you see on the screen now is what you will see every time we get to one of these 4 topics. So we're going to start by thinking about inductive teaching and learning, and Rich is going to talk with you about what that means, and then we'll give you some really concrete examples of what it would look like in your class.
So, inductive teaching and learning, the first of these 4 self-directed skills that we're going to be teaching. And in general, there are 2 ways you can teach a topic or a subject in your discipline. First is a deductive method. And this should sound familiar to you because it's the way all of us in engineering were taught practically everything we were taught when we were in college. You start, whatever the subject is you're dealing with the fundamentals, the basic principles, the scientific laws, Newton's laws of motion, whatever it may be. Then, once you've established those laws and principles, you start deriving formulas and equations. Then you take those formulas and equations that you derived and you start solving problems with them. You go through different examples of how they can be used. And then you send the students off to do something similar, or you send them off to the laboratory or to conduct projects.
What you'll notice here, you've got at the bottom of your screen that those brown boxes are things that the teacher is doing the most of, up in front of the class, talking, demonstrating on the board. And the green, the bright green, are those things that learners are going to do. And so in the deductive teaching, there's a lot of teacher time, and then students do some work at the end.
And when I was a college student or a graduate student, every single course that I took in engineering, in physics, in chemistry, looked like that. Start with general principles and then work your way to applications and problem solving. Here's an alternative approach. And this is an inductive teaching approach. And you may or may not be familiar with the term inductive teaching, but some of you may have heard about inquiry-based learning, problem-based learning, project-based learning, just-in-time teaching. All of those are specific examples of inductive teaching methods. So what is inductive teaching? Instead of starting out with basic principles and laws, you start with challenges. You start your coverage of a new topic in your course by challenging the student to answer a question, or you give them a problem that they have to solve, or you give them some experimental results or an observation in nature that they have to explain. And then you send them to get into groups right there in class. And their first challenge is to define exactly what the problem is. What do we know in this problem we've been given? What do we need to find out? And how are we going to begin? What's the first thing we do? Then you call them back, find out what they came up with, and they will have come up with, in order to solve this problem, I need to know how to do this or that or whatever it may be. Once they've defined what they need help with, what they need you to help teach them, the teacher comes back and teaches. That's you. And you tell them what they need to know. And there may be more that you add. And then you send them back to continue with the solution. And they continue to work. And in the course of doing that, they find that there are more things they need to find out. And so they define, okay, we've gotten this far, but now we need help in doing this next thing. Then you come back in, teach them, and you keep going back and forth like that until they've worked through the entire problem. And that's inquiry, that's problem-based learning. All of these are the inductive approaches. You'll notice with the first one, deductive, everything is you, the teacher, up front until it finally gets to the end of the lectures, the end of the lessons, and now they go off and try to do it. The inductive approach intersperses it. They work, you teach, they work, you teach. It's a big difference. And so then the next question, excuse me for a moment.
The next question is, which one works better? Is it better to start with deduction or better to use induction?
The answer to that question, like the answer to most real questions, begins with it depends. What is your goal? If your goal is short-term retention of information, cram the information into the student's short-term memory so that they can repeat it back to you on the exam, then deduction simply works better. You can cover a lot of material quickly with deduction and get the information into short-term memory, but it's not likely to last there very long. On the other hand, if your goal is long-term retention of information, maybe even all the way into the next course, then there's no question about it. Inductive teaching works better. And this is not just my opinion. There are tons of research studies out there comparing the performance of students who were taught deductively and taught inductively on the same examinations. And study after study shows that the students who are taught inductively learn more and retain it longer. And the other good thing about inductive, where you start with the challenges, is those are real-world challenges you give them, not just pure hypothetical. And what that does is it helps tell the students, here's why the things that we're going to be working on in this course now are important. Here's what you're going to be able to do, the real-world problems that you're going to be able to solve once you know how to do it. And it creates desirable difficulty for the students. Initially, they start with a challenge. You're asking them to do something that they haven't been taught how to do. And they struggle with that. And they're not all happy about that. But they only struggle for minutes, not hours, not days. And that struggling is what sets them up to learn once you start coming in and teaching them what they need to know. And as I said before, tons and tons of research studies have repeatedly shown this is a superior way to teach. It leads to much greater learning. And there's one big problem with deduction that I wanted to tell you about, and that's that it's misleading. It's giving the students the wrong idea about how learning works. So let me give you an example. Let me take you with me into my third year chemical engineering course in transport phenomena, transfer of mass, energy, and momentum. And in class today, in this course, I'm going to take them through a really messy problem. It's the simultaneous transfer of mass and energy into a fluid flowing down the wall of a wetted wall absorption tower. And if those words don't mean anything to you, don't let it worry you. Right? The difference, what I want you to get is the difference between induction and deduction. I'm teaching this deductively, so I'm going to start out by writing the basic equations of change, conservation laws of conservation of mass, energy, and momentum, coupled partial differential equations in cylindrical coordinates. Then, after I've written those equations out, I'm going to start simplifying them and solving them once I get them simple enough to solve analytically. And long before I'm finished with that, I filled the entire board in front of the room. So I erase it and go back and continue deriving the equations and solving them. And I fill the board again. And 2 or 3 boards later, the room looks like this. And there I am, and there they are, and there's the board. And I'm standing over there, and I turn around and I look at the board, and I'm thinking to myself, oh man, I love that stuff. That stuff is so cool. And the students are sitting back there, and they're looking at that board, and that is not what they're thinking. What the students are thinking as they look at that board is, my God, I can't do that. And the interesting thing is the students are right. They can't do that. What the students don't know with this deductive approach is that neither could you the first time you looked at that stuff, neither could Navier and Stokes the first time they looked at it. What the students are not seeing with this deductive approach is how engineering and how science really happen. The false starts, the blind alleys, the filling sheets of paper and looking at it and saying, nah, crumpling it, tossing it out, starting again, until finally, 3 hours later, or 6 weeks later, or 4 years later, you get it. And you understand what you should have done in the first place. And now comes the nice, neat, elegant derivations and what goes on the board there. And what's confusing the students and has them thinking they're probably going into the wrong field. The argument here is that if we want our students to really understand engineering and understand science, we need to show them how it really happens. And how science and engineering happen is not the nice, neat, elegant, deductive presentation.
All right, what we're going to do now is give you an idea of what those challenges look like in your classroom. Not everybody is going to have a totally problem-based, ground-up inductive classroom for everything they teach, but we can all bring those inductive elements into what we do. So we're going to give you a really quick flying tour of several possibilities, and then we'll take some questions from you. We've got one.
Remind them to submit.
Yeah, so be sure that you put questions in the chat as you have them, and we'll be taking them in just a little bit. So before we get to another poll and then some questions, I want to give you an idea of some of those challenges and what they look like. One is an inquiry-based day one activity. So the first day of class or the first week of class, you throw a major real-world problem at students and have them wrestle with, how would I start? What would I do? How would we even begin to start this problem? And I might take that problem from the end of the course, something that they would need all this information to be able to solve it. They don't have that, but they may get farther than you expect, especially students who might have had internships or opportunities to work in the real world themselves. But you let them write those ideas down, and then you use that problem as you're not grading it, you're just getting their ideas, but then that becomes an organizing problem that as you get to each part in the course, you can come back to that problem and say, well, we're about here and we need to get to this step. What do we do? And then you help them. You come riding in on your white horse to help them to see what to do. So it can be a real organizer all the way through.
Just to give you an example of this, our colleague, Mike Prince of Bucknell University, teaches a course in heat transfer, and he teaches it using problem-based learning. And he goes into class on the first day, and he tells the students, your first assignment is to design a heating system for this room, for this classroom. He gets them into groups, puts them to work. They have no idea about how to begin something like this, but they start thinking about it on day one. It's a real-world problem, and it gives them an idea of what the equations that he's getting ready to throw at them can really be used for.
You can ask students to make predictions. We often show or talk about experiments. We might demonstrate something in class, talk about data, but instead of just showing it and then, okay, here's what we do with it, have students make predictions. Have them think about what might happen. What do you think is going to happen? In how might a system respond to input changes? What if we do this or that? I might have a simulation I could use for this purpose so that they could think about what would happen as we change it along the way. That helps students to begin to think about problem definition, to be thinking about what do I do? What might happen? What makes sense? What's logical? What if? You can also involve students in designing and carrying out experiments, but not just the old way that we have often done it in the past, where it's sort of like a cookbook. They go in, they do 12 experiments in 15 weeks. So every week they're going through doing an experiment. We've all kind of been in that situation, know that sometimes we're busy just trying to get our numbers to look like what we think they're supposed to or what the right answer is. Instead, if we use a more inductive approach, shifting some responsibility to the students, they begin to think about how to design. You give them a task, and then they figure out how to design the experiment. You give them enough information and enough of how to use the equipment that they don't blow up the lab, but they get to think about how to design the experiment, how to carry it out, and then what to do with the data once they have it. You can also have students think about definition of problems. So not always solving a problem all the way through. Maybe you present different types of kind of fuzzy real world problems and just ask them to think about what's the problem we need to solve, or what's the relevant information that we know, and what do we need to know? And maybe they never solve the whole problem, but they work with parts of it to think about defining it more clearly. Where can we get the information we need? If you take them through some of those problems, then they're much more likely to be able to define problems in the real world where they're not so neatly packaged. They can troubleshoot. Students love failures, bridges collapsing, buildings falling down, things blowing up, thinking about why might this have happened? How would we predict where failure might occur and prevent it? That troubleshooting is not something we usually ask students to do, but it's a great way to have them think about and get engaged to be self-directed learners in the real world.
This really catches students' attention. Our students generally love disasters. Show them the picture of the building collapsing, the bridge collapsing, and they're sitting at the edge of their seats. And the idea that they're now being asked to come up with ideas for why this might have occurred will get them interested in ways that you can write equations on the board for weeks at a time. You won't generate the same level of interest from them.
And then finally, the kinds of things that we often do in our capstone experiences, design something under certain conditions. That's, of course, the ultimate kind of inductive approach where they have to figure out what to do. The problem is, if students haven't had good experiences with some of these steps early on, they're not going to do a great job of the design when they get to this point. But if you've been incorporating all of these smaller, less elaborate, less time-consuming things along the way, they're going to be much more ready to do the sort of design thinking that we need. What we want you to do, what we want you to do first, we're very close to questions. Do you want to go ahead and take a couple? Okay. Well, let's go ahead. We've got a couple of other things, and then we'll take some of those good questions you have. I'm going to stop sharing, and we have a poll. So if we can look at the Mentimeter poll, that would be great. And what we're asking you here is, if you tried one or two of these challenges, how do you think more of your students would react? A is they would love it. B, they wouldn't know where to start. Or C, they'd be angry that I was expecting too much of them. So take just a moment and think about how your students might respond. While you're doing that, did you have a question you want? We could take a question while they're
I have three questions here, all of which are good, that I'd like to take. But
we'll finish the poll first.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anybody? Yeah. Not knowing how to start seems to be the big response here. And that is often the case, that our students, the reason they react that way is often that they have not been, those challenges haven't been posed for them before. So do remember that we are trying to make sure that we do little steps, providing a lot of structure and support so that they don't feel so lost. Remember earlier we talked about making sure we share good and bad examples, things of that sort that help students to understand what to do. All right, great. We've got some questions, so I will give Rich a chance to answer some of those.
Yes, and that was the first one that I was going to do. So I hear grumpy comments from professors saying, we can't finish the syllabus if we start doing all of this induction. We can't afford to go back and forth in order to complete the syllabus, and we have to complete the syllabus. What is your comment? And there are a couple of things. One is you've got to change some things. When you start doing a new technique, there's some other things that you have been doing that you might think about doing less of. And that's particularly true with inductive teaching and learning. So here's a couple of things to think about. First, if you're just starting to do inductive teaching and learning, or if you're just starting to use active learning, or you're just starting to use cooperative learning, the key is to start slowly. Don't go completely headfirst into the deep end of the pool, because you'll be trying to do too much that's new to you too soon, and you won't have a lot of confidence in it, and the students will smell your fear, and things will not go well. So just do a little gentle inquiry at first, and then gradually build up.
For example, often you'll be doing things like talking about an experiment or showing experimental data. Just throw in that question, that having them predict what they think is going to happen when you run the experiment. Just little things that don't take a tremendous amount of time away from what you're trying to cover. And remember, it helps them really learn it better.
And then the other point I wanted to make was looking at everything you're doing in that class. Information in a class comes in two categories: need to know information and nice to know information. Need to know information is the stuff that's really important that they learn. It's part of the requirement for the course. Courses that they're going to take in the future will assume that they know how to do this, and you're going to test them on it. It's going to be on the exams. That's need to know information. Nice to know information is, well, they should be exposed to it at some time or other, but they're probably not going to use it. It's not going to be on the homework. It's certainly not going to be on the exam. For example, that professor that you just saw in the auditorium with the hieroglyphics over the board from one end of the room to the other, that is not need to know information. Those undergraduate students will never, probably never in their lives, be called on to do anything like the derivation that took that professor 3 days to get through. It's not going to be on the test ever. It's not going to be something they're going to be called on to do in their other course. It's something that the professor really likes to teach, and the professor's feeling is, well, they ought to see how this is done. They ought to be exposed to it. It's a waste of time. Those 3 days could have been much better spent in an inductive approach, looking at some real world problems, but the professor was just feeding his ego. Look at the information you're presenting and ask, is this something the students are really going to need to know how to do? And if the answer is, well, probably not, think carefully about eliminating it or at least cutting it down to make room for some of these other things we're recommending.
Did you have other questions?
Yes. Somebody else asked, what do you think about giving students individualized assessment in which they decide on the project task they want to do and how they will be evaluated?
That is the ultimate self-directed learner type of activity. And that's great to give students experience in it, giving them an opportunity to think about the project and the task. Having some choice increases their level of motivation, and they also having some idea of how they'll be evaluated and some choice in that can be really, really valuable. You want to be careful, though, to be sure that students are ready for that. You want to provide some structure for them so that maybe the number of choices are limited at first, just a few possibilities. so that they can begin to see what it feels like to take that independence and that control.
So in my curriculum in chemical engineering, what I would love to be able to do, and in fact, what I did to some extent, was exactly what you're suggesting, giving them a lot of choice about their project and how to do it and so on when they were seniors in their final year in the chemical engineering curriculum. I wouldn't dream of giving them that much individual responsibility and choice in their very first chemical engineering course.
You do it in smaller steps.
Yes, gently,
maybe
gently.
An assignment, one small project and task. But it's a great idea, and we wholeheartedly endorse it.
Yeah, the object of the game is not to turn them into self-directed learners between the beginning and the end of the course you're teaching. You're trying to get them to take steps along the way so that they start approaching self-directed learning by the time they're ready to graduate from the curriculum.
And you had one more?
Let's see. Yeah, how complex would you? Oh, yes. One more was, can we share the systematic research reported in journal on self-directed learning? Not in this 2-hour webinar. In the handout that's going to be available to you, the slides, the last 3 slides in the handout that you're going to be getting are collections of references, and they point you to some of what we're talking about. Also, we're not doing this webinar to sell books, but since the subject has come up, in our book, Teaching and Learning STEM, A Practical Guide, we have chapters on high-level skills, critical thinking, creative thinking, inductive, problem-based learning, and so forth. And in the book, at the end of those chapters, are references to the research that we're referring to now.
And the sort of godfather of the whole self-directed learning movement was Knowles, and that's a primary important resource, and that's in your resource list. Much of what you'll see out there when you look at self-directed learning is really talking about adults after their education, after they leave the university. And so the kinds of things we're doing is talking about moving them through that process while they're at the university. All right, we're going to go back to our slides and move into the next. Let's see. I have one more quick slide to just give you some ideas. I think we've already said a little of this.
I just wanted to quickly say those were
Great
really
questions.
Excellent questions.
Yep.
Please keep them coming.
Absolutely. So supporting inductive learning, remember, it's new to most students. They tend to be fearful or kind of lost about what to do. So start small and do most activities in class with immediate feedback. Little activities that can be done in a short time. Make your expectations clear and show them examples, and then gradually encourage them to practice those skills independently. So remember, you're thinking about starting small. That also helps you to still cover the content you want to cover. But those small starts can really make a difference in their confidence moving forward. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move into the next section, which is about creative thinking, how we stimulate our students to do this sort of thinking, which is important for problem solving and for their success.
So we're going to propose that there are 4 types of challenges you can give the students to start teaching them to learn to think creatively. There are hundreds, really, but we're just going to focus on 4. One is to get them to brainstorm or to brainwrite, and we're going to be going into detail on each of these 4. I'm just going to run through them quickly now. And brainstorming, as a lot of you are probably familiar with, is just generating lots and lots of ideas for something without criticizing them. Explaining unexpected results is another exercise in creative thinking. You're running an experiment and it's supposed to do this, and instead of doing this, it does something completely different. And your job is to figure out what could be responsible for this deviation from what we were expecting. The third is to make up a problem. The students are used to solving problems that we make up or they get from the back of the chapter in the textbook. Instead of doing that, now this time you ask them, you make up a problem now that I could put on my next exam. And then the fourth is to create something. And we'll look individually at each of these four now.
So we'll start with brainstorming, brainwriting. What we want you to do is look at a long list here. I will show you next. We sat down and did some brainstorming ourselves about what could STEM students brainstorm. What are some of the things they could do? We'll give you just a moment and have you look through that list.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to mention before you start going through it is the idea of this whole webinar is to give you ideas that you can take back to your classes. So as you go through lists like this one, if one of them or if several of them strike you as that would really be good in the class I teach on, whatever the class you teach is, write it down somewhere. Don't count on yourself to remember it after the workshop. You won't. But anything you see that might be something you could use in your teaching, make a note of it somewhere.
And you'll notice as you look at this list that some of the things are big ideas, a lot of things, but many of them are things that could be brainstormed in a short exercise in class or on a homework assignment or in a team. So look at that list and see if you can find something that you might stimulate your thinking of something you could have your students do in your class with brainstorming. Don't forget, you'll get these slides, so you'll have these ideas, but we'd like you to think about 1 or 2 activities you could have your students do in a course that you teach. So I'm going to put the slides once more, and as you're looking and thinking about 1 or 2 things you could do, and Rich, was there a question
just
you
to
wanted
to put in the chat, because we'd like to see what ideas strike you. And don't limit them to the ones listed up there. Think of your own.
Yeah, if you drop something into the chat, that'll give us an idea and that'll cement it in your own mind of something you could have your students brainstorm. I want to share with you, and I hope we get to see some of your ideas. I want to share with you a little bit more information about brainstorming. When you use brainstorming, there's a variation. We know of brainstorming where everybody is calling out ideas and it's out loud and noisy. There's also something called brainwriting, and it works just the same as brainstorming out loud, except that you write your list of ideas individually and then as a group come together, put the list together. It has a lot of advantages about broadening participation. If you're like Rich and I, some of you may be introverts. And as introverts, it's not so comfortable to shout out an answer. Your students feel that way too. And if they have a chance to write some ideas, then they're ready to share those ideas in the group. You get a greater diversity. This is also good because it works in online classes. I can't have my students on Zoom or some other platform shouting out answers to everyone, but they can write things down and they can write things in chat, and it can make a big difference. So consider that. When you try to evaluate brainstorms or you're looking, are they working? What you're going for is fluency, the number of ideas you have. So you want to stimulate students to come up with a lot of ideas, even if some of those ideas are dumb, if they're not the greatest ideas. Some of those ideas will help you get to even more and better ones. You're looking for flexibility, different categories of ideas, something that is really different, that sparks a whole new line of ideas. Originality. You know how there are always students who think of something no one else would think of. That originality. And then elaboration. How much can you build on ideas to make them better? So those are the things we're looking for in creativity. It's not just something that nobody's ever thought of, but it's all these pieces that can make creativity work.
Chocolate is a really good tool that you can use in your class. Bring a whole package of Hershey's Kisses and have little groups work together to generate ideas in response to a prompt that you give. And the group that comes up with the most ideas in 2 minutes gets some chocolate. And the group that comes up with the most original idea or the strangest idea also gets rewarded. The students will have a great time when you do that. There'll be a lot of energy in your class, and they'll all be learning to think creatively.
So to encourage creativity and brainstorming, you want to focus and help students know that you're looking for quantity, not quality of ideas. Of course, you want good ideas, but to get to those good ideas, we need a lot of ideas to choose from. So quantity is what you're going for. You also welcome those unusual ideas. So maybe an idea has little chance of being the right idea, but it's a great one to stimulate more thinking. We build on the ideas of others, and you can share these with your students to help them see that we're putting our ideas together and we're growing our ideas. And the most important thing is withholding criticism. The thing that will kill creativity the fastest is to have somebody say, well, that's not a good idea, or that would never work. We withhold criticism and we write down every idea, even the bad ones. And then later we come back to that list and we may look for the best ideas. But while you're brainstorming, you withhold criticism. So when you're thinking about brainstorming and brainwriting, that's a great tool. But the next one we want to say a little bit about is explaining unexpected results.
Okay, so this is a real world application, if ever there was one. In the university, in our courses, in our textbooks, and usually in our laboratories, everything happens the way it's supposed to. Everything works the way it's supposed to work. In life, it doesn't come quite as neat as that. And so what you can do is something that one of you also suggested in the chat, is to come up with scenarios and ask the students to generate possible explanations. So you can be describing an experiment that was supposed to yield a certain result, and it didn't. And the question then is, unless the laws of nature have suddenly been repealed, this is not what's supposed to happen. What could be going on that might account for it? Or we designed a product, and this will be a hypothetical thing, but you can describe a design of a product that was supposed to meet certain specifications, and it didn't. That's as real world as you can get. And then the question you pose to the class is, what could be responsible for our failure to meet this set of specifications? I carried out this experiment, and I was supposed to produce a clear liquid. And instead of that, there's some gunk on the bottom of the reaction vessel that I ran it in. Now, the obvious thing to do is to say, oh, something's screwed up. I'll send that beaker off to be cleaned and try running the experiment again. But there was one occasion when a chemist ran an experiment, and that's exactly what happened. And instead of sending that beaker off to be cleaned, that chemist said, what is that? I never saw anything like that. Well, let me run some tests on it. To make a long story short, that's how Teflon was discovered. True story. And then when something so ridiculous happens that, this is just absurd. This cannot possibly happen in the real world. A popular saying that scientists use is, who ordered this? And so on. You can easily make up questions of that sort in every single class that you teach, because there's not a single topic, there's not a single subject, there's not a single experiment that can't go wrong and doesn't go wrong sometimes. Just pick anyone that has something to do with your course, throw it at the students, see what they come up with. And the more you do it, the better they're going to get at it.
Now we're going to think just very briefly about making up a problem. Some of you have probably done that before in your classes.
So here's the way this goes. And I have used this in every course, every engineering course that I teach. It turns out to be a wonderful exercise of creativity. So the simplest version of this is make up a challenging problem on the topic that we've been covering in this class this week, one that I could put on a homework assignment or an exam. Or once you've done one or two of those, the next one is now make up and solve a challenging problem. And then when you've done a couple of those, based on material covered in this class, and in the organic chemistry class you're taking this semester. So put the two of them together now and make up a good problem with that. And make up a problem. If you just make up a problem that given this and this and this, calculate that, and you solve it correctly, you'll get a minimum passing grade on it. But if you make up a problem that requires the student to exercise creative thinking, and then you solve it creatively, you'll get top marks for it. And finally, I'm giving an exam, a midterm exam on Friday this week. And one of the problems is going to concern the following process system. Make up a problem that I could put on that exam. And if one of you comes up with a problem that I really like, I will put it on the exam. So that student at least will know how to solve it. I've done all of these. It works beautifully. And you'll find that some of your students are unbelievably creative when you turn them loose and ask them to be creative. I've gotten problems that I had a hard time solving. I've gotten problems that were hysterically funny and so on. Try it, see what happens.
And then our last category of creative thinking challenges is to create something. But instead of just thinking about capstone design, think about some of the smaller things you could do. Have students sketch plans for a bridge. Just sketch it out, an intersection, a device, an app, a playground, something connected to what you are doing in your class, and have them just do some brief, quick plans for something that hasn't been created before. Then maybe at another time, outline some steps. What would they need to do to realize the plans? You're not going to ask them to do it, to take it all the way to completion, but what would they need to do? And that could be sprinkled through the curriculum all along, from first year all the way through the final year. They might build a prototype of something, small scale or big scale. And then finally, completing a full-scale capstone, big design. But if you've done those little creations along the way, students will be much more creative and much more able to do that big design when the time comes, and then take those skills out into the workplace as well.
And of course, if you're teaching a course in computer science and they're learning Python or C or Java or whatever it is, asking them to write a program to accomplish something and make it really challenging. Some of our students know more about computers and programming than some of our systems programmers. And if you turn them loose like that, again, you can be amazed at what some of them are able to come up with.
Now, we've talked about a lot of things, so we want you to think about this yourself. Is there something you could have your students create in a course that you teach? Don't forget, though, that along with the creation, you need to support them. You want to regularly include those creative challenges in in-class activities and assignments. So not just once in a while, but put them in fairly regularly, just a question or two. Do creative activities in small groups where they can build on the ideas of others. Show examples of really fluent creative thinking. So you might ask them to do something, generate ideas. What was your idea that had the hamburger?
Oh, yeah, this was, of course, in fluid dynamics that I was teaching. And the problem was to brainstorm as many ways as you can think of to measure the viscosity of a fluid. You get a point for each new method different method you come up with.
Up to 40 or something.
I put a maximum on it. And like if you say use a viscometer and you give me 40 different viscometer fluids, you'll get 1 point for it. But I said you get double credit if you can come up with a method of measuring viscosity that involves the use of a hamburger. And they came up with an amazing variety of things. And obviously you can substitute any object. I just picked a hamburger at random. But I had some students who dropped the hamburger into a vat of the fluid and measured its settling velocity. I had another student cover a solid surface with the fluid and skip a hamburger across it like you skip a stone on the water. I had somebody say, I would pay a laboratory technician, I would give a laboratory technician a hamburger if he'd measure the viscosity of the fluid for me, and on they go.
So there are all kinds of fun. This is the fun part, I think, in the kinds of things we can do. All right, we want to finally discuss why all ideas, especially the kind of crazy creative ones, are important in brainstorming. And it's because something that's different, something that's a little crazy, may lead you in a direction that you hadn't thought of before. So now we want to take questions again. If you have any, drop them in the chat. Have you seen some, Rich?
I have not with this.
We'll see. And let me stop sharing so that I can. How complex should we craft the challenges so that they fit students with various backgrounds? That's a really good question. Remember, we scaffold, so we're not too complex at first. We gradually increase the complexity. So we're bringing more of the students along who are at various stages. This is also why I really like to use small groups working together on a challenge, because everybody, especially creative challenges, you don't have to be the straight A, the top grade student in order to have a creative idea that the group can use. And so everybody has something that they can offer. But again, I would scaffold. I wouldn't start with really high complexity. I'd build a little bit more each time.
The other thing to do is to remember that in all of the classes you teach, you've got a range of abilities among the students. You've got some who are smarter than you. Practically every class I've ever taught, somebody, and usually several, were a lot smarter than me. Others who are sort of in the middle, and then some who are struggling. And the key is you don't design the class for one group, for just the middle or for the high end, but you present a range of difficulty, and you put enough of the high level stuff in to separate the A students from the B students. So typically on my tests, I'll have something like, if it's a 100-point test, I'll have 10 to 15 points worth of the high-level stuff, so that a student who can't get any of them is still going to get a respectable grade, 85 or thereabouts, and get a B or a B plus in the course. And then most of the test, you're aiming at the middle.
There's an excellent point that was in the chat that I want to bring up here too. Someone said that at UKM, there was once an integrated project across different, if I'm understanding it correctly, across different disciplines. Those kinds of things are really, really excellent for us to use to have our students thinking in different ways. So I was involved for a while where students in mechanical engineering were working with students who were in our design course in the School of Design at NC State. And so together they came up with ways to improve designs, with the design students often having the more way out, really wild ideas, and the engineering students kind of tempering that with what's really possible. So there's a lot of great learning that can take place where business students work with engineering students to do a design, or across different disciplines. So that's a great idea. And I can see all kinds of interesting things in the chat. You've got some great ideas going. Any others that you wanted to... Oh, this is good. I saw this one before. Currently, we're facing the COVID-19. So the majority of students are having online classes. How can the educators enhance their interest and understanding in their study? Such a big problem, and a big problem across the world right now, and for universities everywhere in the United States, a tremendous amount of struggle of how do we do this, and how do we do this in a way that will work. I think that a lot of the positive kinds of real world ideas are excellent for the online classroom because they have a lot of motivation built into them. Students are interested in real world, real problems, real solutions. We also encourage people to put students into groups they can communicate with each other using their devices often, or, FaceTime hangouts where they can get together to work on some of these projects that we're talking about, so that they don't feel so isolated. There's a real problem with students being at home or being back in their room, and they don't have that sense of being a part of the community. And so these sorts of activities are really great for making them more excited about and interested in what we're trying to teach them. And we may have to let go of a little bit of content coverage because in this situation, students are struggling. Sometimes they don't have the kind of access that they really need to do the very best work. And so we may have to really come down to what are those essential things and how can we keep them interested and motivated. Did you want to add? Yeah.
Well, just it's another good brainstorming exercise. Get them in groups in the class, in your online class perhaps, and say, generate ideas for making this course more interesting to you under these circumstances. And once again, students, I think people generally, unless they have some sort of brain damage, are born creative and they're born scientists. And if you had little kids, they want to know everything. What's that, Daddy? What's in there? How does that work? And so forth. They're curious. And they come up with wild ideas sometimes. Put that creativity to work and reawaken it in your college students by giving them challenges like, what can we do in this class to make it more interesting to you since we're stuck at home watching it over Zoom or whatever it may be. And some of them will come up with really fantastic ideas if your students are like mine.
Also, if you use discussion boards, threaded discussion forums, you may call it, those are great places for brainstorming, for critical thinking, setting up challenges and questions that students can think about. I want to put, this is a slight diversion, but I want to say one more thing before we leave this and go into some of the additional ideas that we have for you. And that is the notion of support. We talk about challenge and support. Right now, our students are having, and we are having tremendous challenges. We're way over on the challenge side of the weight of the pillar, and thinking for ourselves, but thinking for our students, what kinds of support do they need? And I want to share with you, there was a big study done in the United States on the student response from March to May in the spring, when they suddenly had to go to the online environment. And they looked at all kinds of different things that made students feel more satisfaction. And one of the most important things, in fact, the most important thing, was their professor sending them an email, a personal note, asking them how they were doing. and if there was anything that that professor could do to help to make things work better for them. That was by far the thing that made them feel most satisfaction with the class. That's easy to do, and it can make a big difference.
There's one more question on there that I'd like to take, and then let's move on to critical thinking. Suhairi, who has been making wonderful comments, says, what would be the realistic duration of doing make a problem or create something in class? Generally speaking, for those two, I wouldn't do it as an in-class exercise. That would be more like on a homework assignment. So typically, I give 2 or 3 homework assignments a week in my course, and typically they're 3 or 4 problems, and typically one of the problems out of the 3 of the problems are given this and this, calculate that, and one of them is make up a problem that has something to do with what we covered in class this week and what you covered in organic chemistry and so forth, or create a sketch a plan, formulate a plan to do this or that. So that would be one problem out of 3 or 4 on a semi-weekly homework assignment.
All right, great. We're going to go back in now. If I can get all my, yeah, there we go. Learning the technology as I go. Now we want to move into the realm of critical thinking. And I think this one is so important. I often think our countries wouldn't be in the political situations we get in if more of us were critical thinkers, if we had created enough critical thinkers in the world. So we're going to think about critical thinking, which is important to success. Rich is going to do most of this one, giving you first a definition.
All right, so what is critical thinking? Critical thinking means a lot of different things to different people, but the definition that we like and use is it's judging the quality, value, or validity of something, like a product, a process, or a procedure, or the superiority of one alternative over others, and justifying the judgment using evidence and logic. That's what we mean by critical thinking. So you're either judging how good is this, whatever it is, or here are several alternative ways of doing something. Which one is the best one? And why? So, what are the challenges that we can offer along the lines of critical thinking? So again, here are 3 alternative designs for this chemical reactor. Based on everything we've been teaching you for the last 3 weeks in this course, for this process, which design would you say is the best one and why? And so they would have to come up with criteria. Is it provide the greatest product yield, or is it the most economical, or is it the safest, and so forth? Or come up with a safety plan for this laboratory and justify its likely effectiveness. Or here are 3 computer programs, all accomplishing the same thing. Which one is the best one and why? Which is the best derivation? Here's the data set. Here are 3 alternative interpretations of it. Which would you choose and why? And the key, though, is whatever you ask them to select from among the alternatives, they have to come up with a justification of the selection. And there is not one correct answer usually. If they come up with criteria, make a selection, demonstrate that their selection is validated according to their criteria, they get full credit for it. Somebody else could make a different selection and justify it and get full credit for that. Here's a case study or an ethical dilemma. Recommend a course of action for the central character in this case study or dilemma and justify your recommendation. Again, come up with something, justify it, and how well you justify whatever it is will determine the grade you get on that assignment.
This is a great way to bring in real world problems. The case study, a little vignette from industry, an ethical dilemma that brings in some ethics into thinking about engineering. Often in engineering, Students don't think of ethics as being closely related, but there are many ethical questions when people are practicing engineering that they have to make decisions about. And so giving them that in a regular engineering class can be incredibly powerful.
Okay, so I'm teaching a lab course, and the students are going to be running experiments, probably in teams, and submitting reports to me.
Or they're doing a project, a research project. It could be all kinds of different things.
Right. And so before they start working on their project or their first experiment, I talk to them a little bit about how I'm going to be judging their reports when they hand them in. What criteria am I going to use? If I have a rubric I'm going to use to grade them, then I go over it with them. And then I give them a sample report, and I ask them to get in their groups and see if they can reach consensus on what grade should I give this report. And they do that, and they use my rubric if I have one, and they come in with their recommendations. And I get the recommendations from the group, and then I show them what I would give that report. And the trick here is the first report that I give them to grade is terrible. I make up, usually I can always find some students who hand in terrible reports that I can use with the names removed.
In future classes.
Yeah, in future classes. Usually I just make up a terrible report myself, and then I give it to them to grade. And they can see that it's terrible. I make practically every mistake I know a lot of them are going to make when they hand in their first report. But they can see it, and they give it a low grade, and we discuss it, and I show them the low grade I would give it. And then I might give them a second sample report that's much better, but still has mistakes in it. And they go off in their teams, and they grade that one, and we discuss it, and I show them what I would give that. Then they go off to do their project, to do their experiment, and turn in their reports. Now, once I've done that exercise with them, they've been put on notice. Here's how this guy is going to grade me. Here are some mistakes that he would rip me to shreds for if I made him. And what happens when I've done this is their first reports are better than anything I'd previously seen before I started using this technique, except for the very best students by the end of the semester. So that exercise doesn't take much time. You can do it in one class session, but it gets you tremendous returns on the quality of the reports you then see from your students. Critique an article or an editorial, an op-ed from the paper, and you evaluate its accuracy, its persuasiveness, identify assumptions. This is something we never teach our students to do, but we need to teach our students to do it, to make them able to do that when they go out in the world. And if we do that a few times with them, then that can give them a big jump up toward becoming self-directed learners.
And once you've gone through a lot of this kind of work, you might ask students to do some self-evaluation, to look at how well they've met learning objectives in the class that you've been teaching them, and justify that. Giving themselves, I have a colleague who actually has students grade themselves. He can raise or lower the grade, but it's a way to really get students to think about how they're doing. Think about critical thinking activities, and when you have some time after this class is over, take some time and think about something you might like to ask your students to do for critical thinking. And the more we thread it through the curriculum, the better our students will be at thinking in these ways. So to support critical thinking, you want to embed these exercises in assignments and exams. In assignments, just having that extra justify the choice can make all the difference in the world in a simple problem you put on homework. Use a rubric. Rich talked about a rubric, a grading form that allows us to rather efficiently look at students' work to see in critical thinking assignments if they're applying good principles of critical thinking. If you've not seen one like this before, if you search in your favorite search engine, critical thinking rubric, we did that before we put that in here. And there are lots of really good examples that will give you a chance to see what they look like. In class, Rich talked about this already. Before you give those critical thinking assignments, show some examples of the kind of thinking you want. And think about modeling those steps. When you do critical, you're showing them how to approach some critical thinking task. Tell them what you ask yourself. What are you thinking about? And that helps them to see what they're going for in their own thinking.
I want to give you one more that we didn't put on the slide that just occurs to me. You can do something very easily that combines creative thinking and critical thinking. So what I do is I take one of my problems in my engineering course. Let's say it's, again, the reactor design course. And I say, for this flow rate of this reactant, how big does the reactor have to be to get an 85% yield of the product? And they go through the calculation. That's what they've been learning to do. And that was part A of that problem. Part B of that problem is, okay, now suppose you build the reactor exactly as it was designed and you run it exactly as the design called for. And instead of the product yield being 85%, it's only 50%. How many possible explanations can you think of for the discrepancy between what you predicted and what you got? And that's part B of the problem, and that's a pure creative thinking exercise. Part C can be, now take the list of possible reasons for the failure of the process and prioritize what are the top 3 in order of likelihood, and what would you do to check which one of them is responsible? And that's a good critical thinking question. And you can do that with any problem, again, in any course that you teach.
All right, we have another opportunity now for you to ask questions. So if there are any questions in the chat, we'd be happy to take those. Let's see. Someone's asking about how to do the create something in synchronous or asynchronous classes, and thanks for the answer. In synchronous classes, you're doing pretty much what you would do if students were sitting in front of you. If you have the potential to have breakout rooms, as some of our platforms do, that can allow students to work together in small groups to do one of those creative exercises where they can share a whiteboard and they can work with each other to create something or describe something in one of the assignments. If it's asynchronous, there's actually some value. You can assign a relatively small group, but bigger than what you might in class. You might just have 3 or 4 students together. You might put 6 or 8 students together on a discussion board to talk about, share ideas, to come up with something, to come up with questions, review for the test, all kinds of different things like that. And you can use that technique, the discussion board or the discussion forum, with not the whole class, because that gets to be too cumbersome, but a reasonable number of students, under 10, so that they get to know each other and they work together to do those sorts of creative assignments.
Also, in asynchronous, a lot depends on what kind of connectivity the students have on their own at home or in dormitories or wherever they are. If most of your students have internet access, then even if your course is asynchronous, they can meet in small groups synchronously with Google Meet or with Zoom or with WhatsApp, with Skype, whatever it may be. And you can assign the groups to create something or make up a problem or whatever it may be. And they can work on their own and create the product and then submit it to you.
Yeah, it takes, we're all having to learn very quickly how to manage those different environments. But there's some good techniques you can use. Someone asked the question to the other academicians, and it's a good question. Do you share your rubrics for design projects with with your students before they do the design. And yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing a lot of people say, yes, I share the rubric. We worked with a colleague who used to say that teaching and learning should not be a mystery religion. It shouldn't be something you have to seek out and it's all covered in haze. No, let's make it clear to students the kind of thinking we want and that we're looking for. That doesn't mean every one of them will reach that highest level, but many more of them who have that capability will, if we are clear in our expectations. All right, we've got, want to go into that last of the 4 categories that we've been working on here. And let's see. And now this one has to do with metacognition. And many of you are familiar with that term. I know Khairia uses that in some of the work that she's done. And so metacognition is one that's out there in Malaysia in many places.
Interestingly enough, one of the comments that we got in the section related to critical thinking was these exercises would be an excellent way to teach students metacognition, which they are. In fact, everything that's up till now is going to be contributing to their ability to think metacognitively.
When we talk about metacognition, the simplest way to describe it is that you're thinking about your own thinking. You're reflecting, you're thinking, have I really learned that? What do I need to do next? What might I have done differently? And so forth. So what we're going to be doing now is sharing some ideas about how to embed that. But really, some of you are picking up already on the idea that all 4 of these elements are interrelated and interconnected. And you can kind of do all 4 simultaneously with many of, or at least more than one, with many of the projects that you may do. When we think about metacognitive challenges, we can do something really simple. Many of you are probably aware of the minute paper. At a minute paper, you stop the class with a couple of minutes to go at the end of a class session, and you ask students to write either on a piece of paper without their name on it that they're going to hand to you, or if it's online, there may be a mechanism for gathering student feedback, and you want them to write what was the main point of class today, what was the muddiest point, or the least clear point, or the biggest question you still have. And the idea there is that you just read through them very quickly. And so even if you have a very large class, you can very quickly scan what they've put, and you will look for patterns and common questions. The main point gives us information about how well we organized the class and summarized. And if they're all over the place, we know we maybe needed to pull things together a little better. But the muddy or least clear points are the really interesting ones. Often those are the things that we thought everybody understood, but it just went right over their heads, and they didn't understand anything after we skipped over something that we thought was obvious. Or it may be that example that we were working on at the very end of class, and we ran out of time and we rushed to finish it. And then you go back into the class the next day and you thank them for those papers, and you say, here were some common questions that came up. Why are we putting this in the metacognition? We're putting it in metacognition because often students don't stop to think, did I really get that? What was the important thing in class? Are there things I don't understand? So these are baby steps to get students started thinking about, hey, I'm supposed to be learning every day. Am I getting what I'm supposed to get? We can also make a clear practice of having students ask themselves questions when they're problem solving. And we can model this, and we can embed these kinds of questions into the assignments we give students. Asking things like, does my solution make sense? Rich often talks about students who have to calculate the size of a reactor, and comes out like twice the amount of the Atlantic Ocean, and they don't see anything wrong with that solution. This idea of, does it make sense? Is it rational? Does it work? How many different ways can I check my solution? So I've got it. I think this is right, but how do I know it's right? What can I do to check it? What might go wrong in my design or my plan? Or if I do something this way, what possibilities are there for it to go wrong? And can I prevent that? What are my assumptions? Are there other assumptions that a person could make that are reasonable? So thinking through what they're really thinking about when they problem solve. Is there a better way I could do this? So these kinds of questions, you want to integrate them into problems and projects, not all at once, but when they're appropriate, because you want to develop these habits of mind for metacognition. A critical place for metacognition for students is in their preparation for quizzes and exams, because that's a place where thinking about your thinking. Do I really know? Have I studied enough? Have I studied the right things? Can be really valuable. We're going in just,
What Rebecca is about to tell you now may be the most important thing that you could do for your students, because as she will explain, most of our students go about preparing for exams in an extremely ineffective way. And there are much better ways to do it that we get from the cognitive scientists. If you get this information and pass it on to your students, you'll be giving them help for the rest of their lives.
We're going to start this section with a poll. And so I'll stop sharing. And the Mentimeter poll should be there up for you. And it's asking, what advice do you, as the teacher, commonly give your students about how to study for your test? And you can select more than one. A is take practice tests. B is set up problem solutions from examples in class or your homework without looking at the answers, so trying to set them up by yourself. C, go over your graded homework solutions. Or D, reread your textbook and notes. So take a moment and think about what you usually tell students to do to prepare. And whenever there are enough answers for us to see some trends, we'd be happy to, yeah, good. I see some of you are still responding, and that's great. We'll give you another moment or two. All right, so terrific. You're kind of all over the place, lots and lots of different ideas, with lots of you suggesting the most so far, setting up problems from examples or homework without looking back. So trying to solve them on your own. A lot of you are mentioning practice tests. And then we see people suggesting rereading textbook and notes and then going over graded work. So great, lots of good ideas. We're going to share with you now what the research has shown about these sorts of techniques and which ones work best. And so just think about what you picked. And at this point, I'll go back and show you what we know from the research. Let's see. I think the Mentimeter is still showing. Okay. Let's see. Yes, great. Okay. So the common method that most students, if you ask students, what do you do to study? This is what they mostly say. They reread their text or skip around reading their text, looking at sample problems. They move their eyes over the text and they reread or go over. What they say is, I go over my old problem solutions. The problem with these two methods is that they give students a kind of an illusion. What that means is they think, because, oh yeah, I remember we talked about that, or oh yeah, I remember this is how you do that problem. They think they know how to do that problem, but they really don't. They just have a familiarity with it that makes them think that they're competent in solving it. What is a better approach, that the research is very clear, the brain research has shown that this technique of studying, and many of you got this exactly right, so congratulations, is this type of studying. First, to self-test. So things, information that you need to know, terms you need to know, principles you need to know, that you self-test, that you do flashcards, that you take practice tests if those are available, and that you reproduce problem solutions without looking back. And if you can't remember something, you look it up, you put it aside, and then you come back and try to set up the problem solution again. What this does is it gives you tremendous retrieval practice. So you're going back in your head and you're retrieving that information, that process. And the more you retrieve it, the easier it is to retrieve the next time. And we also want to help students see that you want to spread it out over time. So their typical response of cramming for the test the night before works against them, because over time to have that retrieval is going to make it work better. So there are a couple of things that we have in the handout that's going to be, the link is going to be put into the chat, and then the link will be available on the YouTube information for those of you who want to access it. And I would encourage you to do that. There is something called tips on test taking. We want to teach our students to prepare for and take tests, because that is a process of learning, so that when they're out in the world and they need to be self-directed to learn something new for their job, that this idea of how do you take it in and really learn it, and how do you know if you've learned it, is a critical skill for them to have. So they don't come in knowing how to prepare and take tests. So you might want to give them some tips on test taking, how to prepare, what they might do. And there's a nice, concise handout that you have the link to in the resources. You can share that just as it is with your students, or you can take that and modify it to match what would work best for your students. Another thing that you might try is something called an exam wrapper. And an exam wrapper just gets students to think about, after an exam, how they prepared for it, how they took it, whether or not they were satisfied with the results, and what they're going to do the next time. And so the idea is to have them think about, I've gotten my grade. How did I prepare for this test? Did it work the way I hoped it would? And if not, what can I do the next time? We have a sample exam wrapper that Rich has used called Memo to Students Who Are Disappointed with Their Test Grade, which gives a series of questions about homework and about test preparation that they can answer. And anything that they answer no to gives them some ideas about what they could do to prepare better. So that's available to you. You can use exam wrappers, but you can also use homework wrappers that are the same kind of thing. How did I do? How did I approach this? What could I do better next time? And that's teaching students that self-directed learning. So think about that. Some of you might want to modify some things that you tell your students, or maybe be a little more emphatic about these ways of studying that we know work best. So when you're thinking about supporting this metacognitive thinking, you want to support this all the time. Use the minute papers, take those seriously, use them to improve instruction and to help students get better at thinking about their own learning. Model your own ways of thinking, the questions you ask yourselves, your thinking, verbalize your thinking, so that students can tell that you think about your thinking, and that you sometimes go down wrong paths, realize it, and correct. And that's really valuable. talk about the importance of metacognition and study strategies, particularly before and after tests. And we have some questions. We want to take some questions. We have just a couple of final comments after we take a few questions. So
the one very good question from Abdul Rahman that I wanted to address, and it's a general question that he asked. And his question is, how do you develop STEM interest, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics interest in students as part of their career development, as opposed to a superficial subject that you take just to take it, or maybe because you heard that you'll get a high starting salary? And I think that's an excellent question. And I think it speaks to what's wrong with the way engineering has been traditionally taught. I went through my undergraduate education basically doing one thing, except for a couple of laboratory courses. And that one thing was I'm given some information about a process, and I'm asked to calculate some other information about the process. And I go and write the appropriate equations and then solve them. And that's what I did. And I get the idea, you would get the idea that all engineers do out in the world is derive and solve equations, 90-something% of the curriculum. But that's not why most students go into engineering. Some do. They love deriving and solving equations, which is fine. But a lot of people go into engineering and science because they want to make a difference in the world. There are a lot of important problems that need good science, need good engineering, and our students, many of them want to make a contribution to that. And if all they see is deriving and solving equations, they're going to get the idea that I made the wrong choice. This is boring, right? I want to make an impact on the world's environmental problems, health problems, safety problems, and so forth. And so I think the key to Abdul Rahman's question is bring the real world into our courses. Teach inductively. When you're getting ready to start on a topic, maybe very, very mathematical, but bring in some real world problems of the kind that the math is going to be used to solve, and let them get into some of those, and then introduce the tools that they're going to need, including the math. And I believe that the more we do that, the more we're going to be attracting people to come into our curricula, and the more they're likely to decide, this is great stuff. I want to do that after I graduate. And more of them will do whatever is necessary to put themselves in the position of being able to do that.
There's another question from Kyria, actually. Can you share about helping students set learning goals? I ask my students to do this to help them develop metacognition. How can we make that interesting? Well, before I think about making it interesting, the most important thing about it is it's really effective. There's research to suggest that if students set their own learning goals in a course or in a project, that they perform better. And it has to do with that enhancing that metacognitive thinking about what is it I'm trying to do, and then they're clearer about how to do it. One way to make it interesting to students is to share that with them, that it's really clearly going to help them make better marks, have better marks, do better, be, learn more, but it improves their grade, and that sort of makes students more interested sometimes. I think it's also really valuable in setting learning goals that students get to share those with one another, because it's in that talking about it and sharing about it that it becomes more interesting and more meaningful. So I would say always making sure that they have an opportunity to bounce their ideas and their goals off of someone else. Now, obviously, it's nice when you can give them some feedback on that, but that peer support and peer coaching in a way of helping students to define what they want to learn can be really valuable. There's another one right above that, which in the chat, which is about emotional intelligence. And I think many of the things we're talking about really touch on this idea of emotional intelligence. So it's not just the logic and the, calculation. A computer can do that, but it's the human element that we're bringing in to our instruction. Do you want to mention a little more?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a part of engineering. It's a part of life, really. Engineers come out thinking that it's all about equations and formulas, but it isn't just about that. Because no matter how good you are at math, and no matter how brilliant the results are that you're getting, you're going to have to communicate them to other people. You're going to have to share those results with colleagues, with bosses, with customers and clients. And how well you relate to those different people could have a lot more to do with your success in the profession than how good you are at solving differential equations. And so anything that you're getting in school, and this is something we need to convince our students, who many of them just want the equations, and anything that involves teaching them how to communicate it and teaching them how to relate to others, which is really what emotional intelligence is all about, is going to be vitally important for their career success. And self-directed learners who are truly self-directed and successful learn that fairly quickly. They've got to pay attention to their relationships with others. Otherwise, no matter how brilliant they are, they're going to have trouble succeeding, no matter what their field is.
I think also many of these tasks work really well in the small group setting, working with other people, and they call on different skill sets that different students may have. And I often would have students with a really creative assignment. Some of the students who might not have been the ones with the top grades may have been the ones with the most creative kinds of outputs when it came to those sorts of problems. So when we're giving a whole range, we're helping students to see other people's skills and their own skills and how they can work together to produce a good result. And I think that's really excellent for building a stronger emotional intelligence in students. That's going to really help them down the road to be successful, because many of our students aren't going to be technical engineers for very much of their careers. They'll be managing other people. They'll be going up the ladder, and that's maybe the most important thing that they're going to learn. We're going to share our screen for just a final little bit that we want to remind you of. Oops, let's see. There we go. All right. So just a quick reminder, we've been talking about growing these self-directed learners, thinking about inductive teaching and learning, creative thinking, critical thinking, metacognition. But I want to say to you before we go in our last little bit that we don't expect you to take everything that we've talked about and try to do all of it.
Oh, don't even think about trying to do all of it.
Remember what we say about our students is the same thing for us, that start in manageable steps. Take a few steps, see how it works, try a few of these ideas, then maybe if something works, keep it. If it doesn't, let it go. Try something else. Gradually, you're going to grow into someone who can help grow self-directed learners among your students. So don't forget.
Your final reminder. If you want your students to develop high-level thinking and problem-solving skills, creative thinking, critical thinking, metacognitive thinking, the first thing you've got to do is challenge them to use those skills. Don't expect that they're going to come to you knowing how to do those things. Some of them might, most of them won't. And if you don't ask them to do critical thinking and creative thinking, you can't expect them to learn how to do it in your class. So you must challenge them, but don't forget the other pillar. That whole structure will fall over if it doesn't have the support from both pillars. Challenge them, but then give them all of the support that you can. Help them get over the hurdles that you set for them, and you will see some self-directed learners coming out of your classes.
The last few slides, I'm not going to stop on, but just to let you know that for each of the different sections, we've got some resources for you that we hope will be helpful as you continue your learning about self-directed learning and about all these individual topics that we've shared with you tonight for us, this morning for you. We hope that someone will drop the link into the chat of how people can get to that handout. And we just thank you so much for hanging in there with us and for the tremendous questions, lots and lots of good ones. And
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you very, very much, and best of luck to all of you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca and Richard. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I think everybody enjoyed it.
Well, I
we
hope so.
certainly
We
did.
certainly did. Thank you. We enjoyed the opportunity to share these things that we love so much. So thanks.
Yes, there's so many questions we have to skip the break. Okay, so I'm sure everybody has enjoyed it, and I think there's a lot of fresh new ideas for us to try in class. So not just the more complex approaches, but also the simpler ones that can really make a difference. So it doesn't really take much to try all the some of the methods.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
So I think, well, it's almost time. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it, and I hope to have you again. And hopefully next year we can meet face to face.
That would
I
be
hope so,
lovely.
too.
I hope so. And all of you, please stay well. Wash your hands. Wear your mask. Do all the right things.
We're doing that. We're doing that. So hopefully we will get to learn from you again in the future. And we're planning another webinar, although the date is not fixed yet. So, I would like to thank everybody backstage, Dr. Tengku Zulaika, Izati, you want to bring them up front? Dr. Zaki, Dr. Noraini, they are all part of the team to get the certificates ready. And I think somebody's shy. So I'm not sure if the audience realize this, but it takes a lot of people to hold these kinds of events. So we wanted to hold one every week, but then after trying that, I think it's too much. But we want to bring in high quality knowledge and experts like both of you. So I hope it has been a beneficial 2 hour for everyone. So I think that's about it, Nina. I pass this over to you.
Lincoln.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Haria, and definitely thank you so much, Prof. Richard, Prof. Rebecca, for all the wonderful sharing. I believe everyone is so excited to see the pillars, and they should be able to execute it soon. And okay, we have a very important announcement for the handouts. Don't worry, we will put it into the description link in the YouTube, so you can access it there. It should be available somehow, so we will keep you updated. Okay, so no worries about that. Another important announcement that we have is the UTM-CE also will have the let me share the Asian Journal of Engineering Education. So for those who are interested to write any papers, we welcome those papers that bridge the world of theory and practice in engineering education in the scope of engineering education research, EER, and scholarly experience sharing on the practice and innovation in engineering education strategies. So don't wait, just contact us, just reach us through the website and also cee@utm.my. So for those who are interested to submit their papers, don't wait and do send it as soon as possible. So today we have a very fruitful sharing and we have amazing audience with a lot of wonderful questions from Dr. Sohari, our committed participant for all the webinars, and we are happy to see all of you guys here and see you guys in our next webinar. Bye. Take care.